and it was unfortunate. So it's starting now.
No, the
Um,
folks that just know me were hoping for a recorded version, so that's perfect.
Good. Excellent, excellent. And I don't know Joe and Carrie, but maybe I do, maybe I don't. I don't know. You can put things in the chat if you want to say hi. Hello, Cody. Excellent. So I think we should get started because we have so much to talk about, and I am super, super grateful that you all came out on a came out. It's pandemic. Anyway, showed up virtually and for this really, academic talk. But what could be more fun, Christina, than what could be more fun than magic and medicine in the Middle Ages?
Not very much that I can think of,
No.
but that's me.
No, no, it is. This is such interesting stuff, and I know you all know me. So I'm Christine Senecal, teaching at Shippensburg University, and I'm a medieval historian, and I also have specialties in ancient Roman history, and am developing fields in history of science, and I have a field. That's me. I think we all. That's good. So, but I want to let my friends here, in case you weren't at the Halloween talk. Can you introduce yourself, Christina?
Sure. So my name is Christina Luo, and I was a medieval historian, although that really never goes away. So I'd like to say that I still am. And I specialized in early medieval England and mostly Eastern Europe and Russia and Central Asia. But throughout all of that time, one of my favorite things to study was, in fact, magic and witchcraft and herbalism. And so I would say that was a sort of sub focus. And now in my other life, I am an immigration attorney. So
Yeah. Oh, there's Nancy. So, yes, Christina and I have kind of dual lives. We were in Boston at the same time or we were in the same areas of Boston. We even went to the same clubs because back in the day we were young and we did that. And then also we went to, we both knew Latin. And so, those of us who have had me in class have had a lecture maybe or at some point in medieval magic. But Christina knows a lot more about medieval magic than I know. So Christina, I'm super, super happy that you're here and willing to do this. And I thought that maybe I could start off with just asking you to explain what if you had to say, okay, what is magic? What is magic? And I'll share the screen so that we can have you can do this situation. So let me get to the next slide. That's not it. We're gonna do a lot of this tonight because Okay.
What is magic?
Yeah.
That's my cue.
And if you're
All right.
wondering, those of us who are watching, like you can just put it on speaker view, but I'm sure you know that already. Okay, go for it, Christina.
Let's go back one.
Why did this happen? Why?
Actually, go back. Yep, what? There we go. Perfect.
Yeah.
So, what is magic? Actually, that really depends. So the definition of magic really changes throughout history. Although one thing remains constant, it is usually defined against whatever the orthodox religion of the day is. Which makes sense, right?
So I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt, but that means that is there always this, whenever magic is being discussed, is there always this illicit air about it?
Indeed. With one in the North African, Mesopotamian, and European context of the ancient world and that part of the world, there is one exception, which we're going to talk about in a couple slides. But generally, yes, magic is always considered over and against whatever the state-sanctioned or most prevalent religion of a particular region is, and it is definitely illicit or usually bad. However, that being said, scholars, including my favorite, Ronald Hutton, who is a great scholar of all things magical and witchy, has a lovely definition that I think is probably the best working definition, that is neutral. I really like it because it's without that value judgment. And so essentially, magic is a set of techniques employed by humans in the hopes of exploiting a supernatural power for their own purposes, be that health or good luck or fortune or love, but really it's when you exploit supernatural power to a particular purpose.
Does summoning a demon also count?
Yes, yes, it does. Because of course, so I'm jumping a little bit ahead. We're going to talk mostly about ceremonial magic today, and ceremonial magic would be any type of magic that employs elaborate rites and rituals and an elaborate set of ingredients, such as stones or herbs or animal parts, for example, to achieve magical ends, usually by placating a particular deity or demon and inviting that deity or demon to come and converse with you or perhaps do your bidding, depending on your level of proficiency in ceremonial magic.
I love it because the way you said it is kind of formal. You're, as you were saying it, and that's what I'm gathering ceremonial magic is. If it meets the following condition, A,
Yes.
B, C. Okay.
It is for the educated, it is for the literate, and it is usually just for men or the male in medieval society.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
But so I'm wondering, Chrissy, what are the similarities between the definition of magic and the definition of medicine?
Well, I'm going to really make a distinction between medicine and magic, but with the caveat that that is anachronistic. Like, not the people back in the day, in the Middle Ages, wouldn't have thought of this distinction. But if we're going to talk about these as two separate subjects, we might as well come up with something. And medicine is something, it's an attempt to explain how the physical world works or to manipulate how the physical world works using naturalistic or physical explanations. So as opposed to magic, which is supernatural, there's you for medicine, it's all natural. This does not mean it's correct, as we'll see. It's like often, and I'm reading a really good book right now. One of the quotes is like, people have been trying to practice medicine for formal medicine for 5,000 years, but until the last 200 years, they weren't very good at it. So it doesn't have to be correct, but it's not supernatural. It's through material explanation. So that's what that is. Maybe, Christina, though, because I was pointing out that magic and medicine, we're distinguishing them, but obviously, because of what I said before, medieval people didn't distinguish. And I'm wondering if you could just speak to that a second or for a little bit.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So, really, and I would say this was absolutely true of medieval Europeans, but it was certainly true of the people upon which medieval Europeans based their experience of both magic and medicine. They did not divide the two. So, what aims you attempted to achieve, be it in what we now call a medical context or in a magical context, really those processes were the same or viewed the same in the medieval mind.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yep. And my slides vanished.
I know. I
So
changed
just
it because we weren't, talking
yeah,
about that. Like,
no problem.
ourselves was done. Yeah. Yeah. So,
um,
okay. Cool.
so yeah, but since that is incredibly broad now, so we've taken these two things and we've separated them into lovely 21st century ideas here, academic ideas, but obviously the medieval mind pushed them back together again. However, we are going to have a separation yet again, just for convenience, because magic and medicine were actually treated very differently, not from one another, but there were two major parts. And Chrissy, I don't know if you want to talk about the division in the medieval mind of magic and medicine.
Yeah, absolutely. Sure. I can do that. So, good news for those of us who like talking about magic, we're going to have another one, magic and medicine, because the difference that I feel we want to make is about whether or not we're dealing with theory or practice. And today we're going to focus on theory. And so we're going to be talking about people that could read about the magic that or the medicine, people that thought about how things worked, maybe trying to come up with explanations. Not so much application. So although you can't totally separate them, it's true that, for example, with medicine, there's this kind of elite cadre of scholars that would have studied and studied and just that's what they did, but they weren't the barbers. Like you think about like the barber pole of today, or like with the red stripes. That's something that's like, okay, you go to the barber for a shave or maybe surgery, dentistry too. It's sort of like mix it all together. No, these are people that are in their kind of monastic rooms writing and reading about the practice.
Mhm. And again, the same distinction can be made with the practice of magic. We refer to ceremonial magicians who were educated and literate men who studied magic, the sort of theory behind magic, although they certainly did attempt to practice it. But these weren't the cunning folk out in the countryside delivering babies or healing ailments, although ultimately ceremonial magicians probably also wanted to induce good health. They really approached it much more from a knowledge-based perspective than a practical application perspective.
Yeah.
So, Chrissy, medieval medicine did not develop in a vacuum. So the scholars just didn't, come up with it wholesale. So, what was the mental framework for how the medieval universe operated and how the medieval conception of medicine came to be?
Christina, I'm so glad you asked. I get to talk about the Greeks. I love the Greeks. So I'm going to share screen again to talk about the Greeks because that's where so much of what I'm going to talk about comes from. You can't really understand any kind of theory about how medicine works without understanding the worldview that the medieval people had. And they got it from the Greeks. Now, I'm going to let you all look at these pictures. And although the one on the right is in Latin, you guys are brainy enough to kind of figure out the cognates for a lot of them. But look at the one in English on the left. And if you look for a second and say, okay, this is a model of the universe inherited from the Greeks that the medieval people thought was real, you could say what's wrong with it. And you would come up very quickly with the fact that the earth is not the center of the universe. But it was for people for 1900 years, from the Greek world up through way, the scientific revolution of, Galileo, etc. So let's look at this. You've got the earth in the center, but notice what else is wrong about this. So obviously we know these are wrong conclusions. Notice that the elements are different. So you have the earth, and then there's a layer of water. And you can see this parallel on the medieval map to the right as well. After the layer of water comes a layer of air. After the layer of air comes a layer of fire. Then you start getting to the heavenly bodies. And notice they don't go in the same order. Like they're not accurate, like in terms of what we know about them. So, okay. After all that, you get to the firmament. And let me kind of go over a couple points here that are really significant that medieval people thought were absolutely true. There's this unchanging is the outermost. And as you go in more and more and more, things change more. For Greeks and then for medieval people too, change is distressing. The body changes, it dies, worms come out of it. That's disgusting. You don't want that. You like things that never change. So those constellations in the sky, well, they might be rotating around, but they're held in place. The planets, though, don't. They kind of wander around. They're the sky wanderers. But things on Earth change a lot. There's another idea. There's an idea that things that are heavy go to the center. So of course, the Earth is going to have the Earth at the center, and then less heavy is air and or water, and then air, and then fire. And then it's thought that you get ever, lighter. The stars were thought to be fixed into this kind of crystal sphere. And all of this happened in the medieval world with a layer of Christianity. So you can see that in this painting on the right, where you've got like Terra, that's Earth, but then these angels going around. And it's thought that the angels are moving these heavenly spheres all around these crystalline spheres. Now, I've described how the universe looked to medieval people, and this would have been educated, but this is a pretty widespread idea. Medieval people did not think the world was flat. They thought it was spherical. It's just that the earth was in the center. More important than where things were and what was wrong about the elements is how they thought about asking scientific questions or causal questions. So we call this teleology. Like, this is an idea that you ask why. And Aristotle, and then medieval people to follow, asked questions like, well, why do the planets go around whatever the Earth? And there would be an answer for that. That's kind of mental shift. I don't think we can really underestimate that, because it means that what you do is when you look at things, you say, well, what is that thing's purpose? And there's a kind of presumption that everything then has a purpose. Today in science, we're more likely to ask, how do things happen, not why do things happen? And it's this kind of way of asking questions for why that is more significant for understanding the medieval worldview, because that's what the medical people were doing. I have to show you this other slide, Christina, because it's really cool and everybody else is going to love it. Okay, well, this is to go on with the other one, but I'm going to skip this for a second. I'm going to go to this one. So I love, okay, Christina and everybody. So we have here, this is Scivias, and it's not an original manuscript, but is describing a mystical vision of Hildegard von Bingen. So you had said that the magical scholarly world was mostly men, but we all know there's this big exception. There's more than one, but the most important
3-4
right, is this Hildegard von Bingen. So I wanted to show for a couple reasons this slide. So here's Hildegard's vision of the universe. Okay, so let's go back. Ta-da! And this. Pretty different? Oh, yeah. So we're noticing some things. We notice that there's water in the very middle, and then there's a moon, and then there's the sun up there. And if you're like, you don't have to feel like you have a 14-year-old brain to think that this is a clitoris and labia, because that's what
totally.
And it begs the question and raises the fact that, you know, when we're looking at the scholarly view of how medicine worked and how the universe worked, we're looking at a worldview that is not representative. And if other people had voices that we knew about, we might come up with more things like this. So she, you know, Hildegard von Bingen, she was a abbess, really well educated. Men went to her to ask for her decisions. So she had very high status. She was no feminist, I mean, at all, but on the other hand, she had a different worldview. So, you know, I'm gonna quote here because I got a quote because it's so entertaining. Okay. This is historian Emily Ann Gisler, and she says, we see the clitoris being the large red star at the top, and below it is the urethra, depicted by the great orb, and below it the vaginal opening, depicted with 4 separate rings. So, you know, I'm not just, it's not just me. And I also want to make a segue because I don't just pick this to show you a potential alternate view of somebody viewing the universe, but and by way of doing that, point out that culture is obviously going to influence this. I also want to talk about another aspect of Hildegard that is reflective of the way that people approached the universe in general. So this is something that I'm going to guess, Christina, you're going to talk to, I hope so. And it's because what medieval people tended to do when they had information about the way the world worked is they like to make comparisons between what's in the heavens above and really, really dramatically, concretely make it connect to what's in the world below.
That's so as above, or and so below, or so above and as below is a stereotypical summation of ceremonial magic in the Middle Ages and the doctrine of signatures. So yes, we're going to talk about that a lot.
Absolutely. And so I'm going to quote from Hildegard, because this isn't about like the universe, but listen to hear how she's going to talk about just the body, this male body. So she says, the firmament, she's talking about the firmament, the things, skies up above, contains stars, just as a man has veins that hold him together. And just as the veins go from head to foot, so the stars are scattered throughout the sky. And just as blood moves in the veins and moves with them with the pulse, so does the fire in stars move them and emits sparks like the pulse. Dun, dun, dun. So that's really fascinating. And I'm going to I want to come back. I want to hear from you, Christina, first for a little bit because I want to know about how medieval ideas about magic didn't develop just in a vacuum. So I'm wondering if
Absolutely.
you could tell me about like whatever antecedents that magic was built upon, and I'll go back to the.
Most definitely. Yeah, there's a slide. It's the Egyptian-y looking one because, spoiler alert, indeed, medieval people did not come up with their ideas about magic in a vacuum. And in fact, pretty much all of the medieval ceremonial magic that we have record of can be said to have its roots, if not specifically, at least in terms of how it was viewed and practiced in Egyptian, um, I will say magic, but also religion, because there are a couple of cool things here that I was very excited to share. First off, Egyptian culture, and we alluded to this in the beginning when I said there was one glaring example of a culture that really didn't treat magic as something illicit, and that would be ancient Egypt.
Yeah.
So in fact, magic was so central to Egyptian culture and Egyptian belief, be it daily life or actually, whether it's government or birth or death or just every aspect it permeated it, that they personified the very idea of magic with this gentleman here in the middle. His name is Hika, and really he wasn't gendered terribly much, but he, they, it was the manifestation of all magic holding the universe together. Now, the cool thing is, Haka wasn't just a deity of magic or the personification of magic, but he was also quite deliberately the deity and personification of medicine. And so his purview spread out over every aspect of Egyptian culture. And then we have a couple of other pictures here. I just wanted to share the many ways that magic was acceptable in Egyptian life. So in the blue, we have a faience illustration of a young woman with a tattoo. Her tattoo is of the sort of chubby guy in the top right. His name was Bess.
Cool. She'd have a tattoo of bats.
Yes, she did. It
Oh,
was similar to amulaic magic that created good health and warded off evil spirits. And the reason why I'm mentioning it is to prove that, yes, indeed, all of this Egyptian magic-y stuff really did end up in medieval magic. We have examples of spells in medieval grimoires to Bess and to Hika and to this little guy over here, this sphinxy dude on the bottom left. His name was Tutu, and he again was a protector against demons and also a benefactor of good health. So we see magic everywhere in Egyptian society, perfectly acceptable, and we also see it as intricately connected to and in fact inescapable from medicine. Moving on to the Greeks and the Romans. So the Greeks and the Romans certainly had conceptions of magic that were in some ways similar to Egyptian magic. However, they were very clearly against anything that smacked of non-state sanctioned religion. And this was especially true of the Romans, less so for the Greeks. So the Romans were actually actively hostile, sadly, to the practice of magic outside of, again, the rituals that would have been prescribed by a typical religion. And you can see that because they had probably Europe's first and most severe witch trials, for example, with an important distinction being that witchcraft is magic, as we described at the beginning of the talk, if it is done for the purpose of harming a person or a society.
okay.
Um,
So it's got to be harmful.
Yes, and so you can see why the Romans might have wondered about the sort of safety or social acceptability of magic because of the little puppet there was the person with the nails in. As you might be familiar with the voodoo doll, the
Right. Yeah.
practice is the same. That would have been an example of magic to cause harm. So, of course, that's the ancient world, right? So what does this really have to do with the Middle Ages? Well, when the Roman Empire took over in Egypt, what happened was the temple system in Egypt collapsed, and all of the priests who had been practicing magic, as was their wont, as a part of a social acceptability, really lost their position in society and they had nowhere to go. And so, as a result, what happened is they became service magicians, sort of on the street, selling their ability to help you get good health and good fortune and love. And from our perspective, the cool thing is that a lot of their practical works survived, largely due to Egypt's climate, and we now have hundreds of texts of Roman magical spells called, well, there's a number of them, but mostly the Greek magical papyri is the large compendium of these.
So
And I love the Greek magical papyri because, well, first off, the magical spells are really cool, and I'm going to share a couple, but also because it represented this cosmopolitan, super eclectic society. In fact, I'm going to quote Ronald Hutton again. He calls it luxuriant eclecticism, because in these spells, we have entreaties to Hecate and Helios, but also Jehovah and Moses and Ishtar and Mithras, and you name it. It got blended into this way of understanding the universe, usually to promote good health. And so, just for this particular picture right here, this is a surviving sample of one of the texts. And the spell, there are two spells on this slide, but one of them, and it's this little guy here in the corner that you can see, that is supposed to be Bess, the same little protector of health that was in the tattoo of this lady and is in the little chubby guy in the right. So it's essentially how to encourage a dream where he would fill you with inspiration. So it has directions on how to draw him very explicitly, and to make a wand, and you cast a circle, and you say the appropriate prayers, and it really, really is pretty amazing. I also do want to share another really awesome spell that was contained in the Greek magical papyri. It is essentially, if you wish, to entrap your shadow and turn it into, for those of you who are of any familiarity with Dungeons and Dragons, essentially an unseen servant. Okay? For real. So you would
right now, what?
you would use your shadow to go do chores for you, I suppose, or whatever. So I just want to share it because it's pretty fun. So if you make an offering of wheaten meal and ripe mulberries and unsoftened sesame seeds and cooked wheat groats, and throw this into a beet, like a beet, the vegetable, you will gain control of your own shadow so that it will serve you if you take this and go at the 6th hour of the day toward the rising sun to a deserted place with a new dark-colored palm fiber basket on your head with a scarlet headband, and behind your right ear the feather of a falcon, and behind your left ear that of an ibis, and having reached the appropriate place, prostrate yourself on the ground and say, "Cause now, Helios, my shadow, to serve me, because I know your sacred name." And then it goes on and on and on. But interestingly enough, first off, this spell to entrap your shadow and enslave it is a prayer to Helios, the sun. So I think that's kind of cool. And also it has all the elements that medieval magic would have, in terms of you need the right stones, you need to dress appropriately, there is a sort of ritual cleansing to it, there's a potion aspect to it, and then there are also the words that you need to speak appropriately at the right time. So we can really see the beginnings here. And these spells all trickle down or into medieval grimoires. So there are examples of the same ones. I know it seems like, well, this is supposed to be about medieval magic, and here we are talking about, Greco-Roman magic, but it's really the same thing. So let's see, I think.
When was the Greek magical papyri?
Pardon?
When were these written?
100 to 400 CE.
And but then they were copied into medieval grimoires.
Indeed, almost wholesale.
And then one of the things that I feel like is fascinating, there's not like an explanation about why it has to be south facing. or like why there's a cardinal, blah, blah, blah. You know what I'm saying? Like, is there ever a discussion about that?
There is. And in fact, when we get to some medieval examples, there's the one, there's a slide with the image of Saturn, and you can dissect the entire spell and explain why. Oh, yes, that one. Sorry, this one right here. Back one. Sorry. Yes, the white square in the middle, that's a picture of Saturn. And there is a spell in the Picatrix, which is this really amazing grimoire that started out in the Arab world, but then was translated into Castilian Spain and then spread throughout Europe as the quintessential medieval grimoire. Like everyone who tried their hand at ceremonial magic needed to own a copy.
Yeah, like that's your most important magic book. If you have to say like one magic book that's the most important, that's it.
That is the most important magic book. But so here's the deal. The spell was really designed to get you to be able to control your enemies. Okay. And as you would want to do. And so in doing so, you would take a piece of lead and fashion a ring. And on that ring, you would carve a guy being drawn in a chariot of dragons, or a chariot being pulled by dragons. And he would have a scythe. Now, anyone who was practicing ceremonial magic, or anyone who was educated, would immediately say, that's Saturn. And so here's the thing. The reason the spell entreats Saturn is because Saturn, being a dark and chthonic deity that really was controlling the more malign forces in the universe, well, if you want to control them and you want your ring to help you control them, you would go to Saturn, right? And so it was made of a substance. It was made of lead, which was a Saturnine element. And interestingly enough, lead poisoning was referred to as an ailment of Saturn up until the 1800s, because the lethargy and depression that you might get if you're suffering from lead poisoning was considered part and parcel with the elemental nature of Saturn. So I guess long story short, you can dissect most of these spells and find a reason for why all of those components existed, kind of logically, or at least within the logic of the medieval mind.
I mean, one of the things that I feel like what you bring up relates to something that I connect with medicine is that both are really operating on the way that the human brain naturally wants to think and find patterns. And whether that's something that is used to develop magic, which is supernatural, or come up with some causative theory based in physical, it's still based on these patterns.
Right. Well, and that would reminds me actually of the connection between the elements, and I referenced it, and the humors. So, I've talked about essentially the humors in magic with Saturn, but could you tell us about the humors in medicine? Because I know it's really important too.
Oh, it sure is. And I love the humors. They are fascinating. So I'm going to go to this slide. So, that's not the one. That's the one. So yeah, the humors are really important for both magic and medicine in the medieval period. And I think that it's fascinating. Here we are with another Greek legacy. Humors are still around in our literature and our kind of vocabulary today. Like if I say, oh, I'm in a really good humor, I'm happy. It's from this ancient Greek past. So it has this long legacy. Originally, it actually meant sap or flavor. And it's referring to some kind of liquid. And it's an idea that the whole body is contained of these different liquids. And health is about whether or not these liquids are balanced. So again, in medical literature today, if you're talking about the humoral system, you're talking about how the immune system operates in the blood with antibodies, or you're talking about fluids besides blood, like for example, blood serum or lymph. And that all comes from these kinds of ideas that there's 4 fluids. There's blood, yellow bile, black bile, And what's the last one? It's phlegm. Gross. And when you were talking about the when we were talking about the patterns, that's something that the medieval people did, borrowing from the ancient tradition. They connected these humors that, by the way, their ideas were wrong about this. Of course, there's blood, of course, there's bile, but they thought that's what explained things. But they connected them to things as above, so below. So you can see on the slide on the right here, and I'll move this panel over just a little bit, but look at like how there's, okay, here we have Mars, and then there's fire, and then it goes down to wind over here, and it's choleric. And then you have Jupiter, and you've got air, and it's sanguine, and that's yellow bile. And then you've got the moon, and you've got water, phlegmatic. And then you've got, this is melancholia, melancholy, and you've got Saturn. So the planets go with the moods. There's also matching with the elements. So a concept that existed in the medieval period was that there was only 4 elements: earth, air, water, fire. There's also maybe ether, but on earth there's just those 4, and from them everything else can be made. So there's this idea that and this really takes us from how the universe is observed to how things are thought to work on the ground with medicine, that like if you have an imbalance in your humors, that's what you treat medically. Therefore, for example, let's just say I have swelling in my arm, and my arm is red. Uh-oh, too much blood. My liver might be causing that. I must need bloodletting. And I'm sure we've all heard of the practice of bloodletting in the medieval period. And that's to take away, there's an excess of blood, so you need to have it go, and that'll restore health. This is all wrong, really, really wrong. But one of the things that is, I think, important about the way that this kind of idea of medicine operated, if you do happen to ascribe causality to only physical forces and not supernatural forces, what that can mean is that it's not your Jewish neighbor's fault that's causing disease. It's something in the natural world. And not everybody, that's not something that people actually all believed in the medieval period. They blended the religious with the natural, but to attempt to have explanations without the supernatural is something that we can trace roots to this medieval period. So it's pretty interesting. I'm going to quote Chaucer here just to show you how the idea about humors was not just a Greek thing. So in the Canterbury Tales, he has the physician say that the cause of every malady, were it of hot or cold or moist or dry, and were engendered, and of what humor. So there's the humors there. So I think that's a really interesting thing. And I wanted to go just to this slide here. This one is a little bit from before, I know. And I wanted to connect it to something more specific about medicine, and this is with the Black Death. So it's an example of how it's not just the idea that you ask questions that are why, like why is the blood red, or why does the stars move less? You ask, it's also just very concretely taking the physical idea about the universe and applying it to medicine. Mm-hmm. So when the Black Death happened, and this is a medieval schema of the universe, and you can maybe see the constellations represented in the rings, and then the Earth at the center. And it's really, back in the day, ordinary people would have been able to follow the skies. You would have known that Orion was in a certain place at a certain month. But to be able to do planets and eclipses, that takes special knowledge. So you're really specialer if you know those things. And therefore, people that wrote about medicine would have been, highly, highly trained, because they would have been able to tell where the stars are going. And where am I going with this? They thought that what happened in the sky caused things to happen in the earth in a really concrete and overly connected way that's not true. So for example, when the plague happened, it's 1347, and you've got, millions of people dying. And in a time when there's not millions and millions of people to spare, I mean, the population is pretty low. King Philip IV of France was like, well, what's going on? So what did he do? He asked the medical university faculty at Paris. So there was a medical university at Paris. And he's like, so explain. And they did. They came up with a statement in 1348. This is like analogous to our CDC. But what they said was that the plague had happened because there was a conjunction of Saturn, Mars, and Jupiter in the constellation of Aquarius in March of 1345. Somehow, an eclipse was also involved. And that's what's causing it. And the reason why is that these planets conjoining caused an air to be disturbed on Earth. Hot air pulls a plague. There you go. A guy got, yeah.
Oh, could I just say, because I can't resist. So from a medieval magical perspective, Saturn, who we mentioned, bad dude, Jupiter and Mars, those are the three planets that are in charge of all the bad things that could conceivably ever happen to you. And so all of these sort of proto-scientists were also, in their own way, whether or not they actually invoked demons, practicing ceremonial magic, because astrology was part of ceremonial magic, and thus we have a connection. So I just wanted to say that.
Totally true. I know. And there's even this guy called Simon de Corvino, and he wrote a really long poem that explained all about the plague, and he anthropomorphizes the planets. The poem was called "On the Judgment of Soul at the Feasts of Saturn," and he's like, well, the sun, Sol, judged the destructive Saturn and the peaceful Jupiter, and it turns out warlike Mars and a lunar eclipse all conspired, and the plague. And what is heartbreaking, of course, from a perspective of today, is you have people that don't understand science that look at things like the Bethlehem star with the constellations, and they're like, look, it's causing what's going on, but they didn't have modern science to ascribe to. They were just working with what they got. So it's, from that perspective, it's a little sad. I wonder if you want to elaborate, though, Christina, on how the universe connected to magic, since I've been explaining how it connects to medicine.
Sure. So the slide with Saturn, if we want to go back to that one, back, let's see, there we go. So on my left, the round one right here, we have a magical version of the earlier picture that Chrissy showed us of the division in the 4 body types, but it's also the 4 directions, the 4 cardinal directions, and the 4 elements. And this is just used from a magical perspective, but it essentially shows that, be it medicine or magic, the medieval worldview grounded their understanding of both with the same information, right? The same understanding of the world. On the right, we have a pentagram from, and I love this so much, the Rawlinson Necromantic Manual. So necromancy is, of course, the raising of the dead, usually for nefarious purposes, but not necessarily. Sometimes you just want to ask them questions, right? Anyway, and so we've got this lovely pentagram. Now, that pentagram, there is nothing sort of stereotypically from a, late 80s satanic panic perspective. There is nothing demonic about that pentagram. In fact, Hildegard von Bingen, my favorite person, and other medieval scholars of her ilk would have seen that as actually being holy, because it represents the embodiment of God in human form. Because if we are made in the image of God, okay, and we have a base form of 5, because we have 4 limbs plus the head, so that's 5. We have 5 fingers on each hand and 5 toes. We have 5 senses, okay? All of these things show the human form in microcosm. And so therefore, that pentagram, totally cool. Now, if you turn it upside down, then you get the demonic stereotypical one, because it is a reversal of God's sacred form. Now, ceremonial magicians work with demons, supposedly, air quotes, all the time. But they never thought what they were doing was demonic or evil, because, much like this pentagram infers, they were attempting to show the world the holy nature of God, and they were attempting to achieve good aims through using divine knowledge and divine tools to control truly evil beings such as demons. So that is a significant difference, such that most ceremonial magicians were never assumed to be practicing what we would consider witchcraft, at least until way later in the early modern period.
Christina, can I ask a question? I'm going to ask so many questions, but one of them is, so, there's an idea that you can use a book with the word necromancy in it and boss demons around, and holy people did this and it was fine.
Pretty much, yep.
So like if I looked at that manuscript, would I find the names of demons and the bad things I would be able to do with them?
Yes, you would, very specifically. Although I have to say, and maybe we could move on, I think, to the next. Well, here's the stereotypical ideal. This one, yes. Oh, back one. Sorry. Forward. I'm dyslexic. One more. Here we go. This guy here on the left is the stereotypical ceremonial magician who would be capturing essentially demons and forcing them to do his bidding, but all to God's will, so it's okay. And then the folks here on the right, we have a stereotypical witch and a stereotypical cunning person, or an essentially person who uses herbs to heal and folk remedies. And there was a division. And if any of the people on the right used demons, they were considered not okay and guilty of witchcraft. And if any of the people on the left did, well, there was a gray area about whether or not it was okay, because demons are bad, but also they're doing it for good purposes using the power of God. So that was the division that was really common in the Renaissance and throughout the early modern period. However, if you asked the average person, especially in the early Middle Ages to the Middle Ages, they would probably say no, that consorting with demons is consorting with demons no matter what your goal is. And it's nice that you want to show the power of God, but on the other hand, they're demons, so you're probably evil. So it's the distinction was a much later one that was sort of put onto the medieval mind, perhaps inaccurately.
That's fast. So when did this grimoire get written? The one that is on the right.
The Rolson one, 15th century.
Okay, fascinating. So before the witchcraft craze.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, so that was when people were, well, the church would have been against it, but people were accepting of these folks because, again, they were practicing medicine, they were practicing magic, but they were the people that the kings went to when they needed explanations for things. Again, these were all, I love the idea, somebody calls it brocultism, because so many of these people were just educated guys without letting women in, all of whom saw themselves as participating in this grand tradition of philosophy, whereby they controlled demons, so it was okay, but like witches, they were controlled by demons, so it wasn't okay.
So bro, as in like it's a bro.
Yeah, like bro.
Did you have a special slide for that? Was that like this one?
Oh, well, these are some examples of some major bros, indeed.
Major bros, Christina, I gotta hear.
So, I mean, no offense to Albert the Great, who was a wonderful saint.
Not all bros.
Not all bros.
Awesome.
So we've just got, there were too many, so I just gave a smattering across, a couple hundred years, because this is a broad overview of medieval magic. And also, I think Albert the Great over here on the far left with the bishop's mitre, he probably wouldn't be very happy to be on this list or part of this discussion, because he really sort of felt indeed that ceremonial magic was unchristian. However, the ceremonial magicians saw themselves as being part of this huge tradition stretching back to antiquity. And so they looked for great thinkers and great philosophers, and then they attributed all of their grimoires to those philosophers. And so Albert the Great was attributed to have written many, many grimoires, some of which you can still buy today. I saw there's like hundreds of them on Amazon. It's really cool. I kind of want them.
I want that one with the word necromancy in it.
Yeah. Oh,
I
and
know
there's a whole bunch.
that came out with a new English translation recently.
Yep. And then we have Michael Scott in the middle and Cornelius Agrippa, who was probably the preeminent occult writer, but he was also a physician, a legal scholar, a theologian. These were all Renaissance men, quite literally, even if they're from the medieval period, who were jacks of all trades and practiced across the board what we would consider all of these things.
Very, very cool.
Yeah. So this is how people studied magic at a scholarly level. How did people study medicine at a scholarly level?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the same crew would be involved, Christina. So, you're not talking about poor people, you're talking about people that can read. To do that, you need money. So these are people that would have been elites, and a lot of them would have been clergy. So they're writing in the early Middle Ages in monasteries, and that means they're away from other people in the world. They're, I shouldn't say completely away, but that's their full-time job is writing. They would have had libraries. These libraries would have contained manuscripts from ancient Greece. And they would have done. That's why so much of it is borrowed from the ancient Greek and Roman corpus, is because they had access to this. So I have this really cool slide of this Roman surgeon, and it's kind of just to illustrate. It's easy to make fun of people for their past mistakes, but I don't think that's a fair thing. Like it kind of back to that universe. It makes sense to think that the Earth is in the center, and because the Earth is the heaviest. And it was also predictive, which is something that we want out of science. We want scientific models to be able to predict, and they were able to predict when the eclipses would be. So I have another example of how medicine from the Roman world actually could have been studied by these monks in the early Middle Ages and later, and treated by scholars in a way that was helpful. And so you see here this panel, it's a Roman surgeon. And it's pretty cool because he's actually, going into that leg and fixing stuff up. It is true, and if I have time I probably won't, but to talk about dissection, that was frowned upon. It was frowned upon also in the Greek world. There's a Roman guy called Galen, and around 200 he comes up with a kind of way of describing the body, but he dissected different types of apes, Barbary, let's see, they were called, Barbary apes. And that's obviously not the same physiology as a human, but it's not just a medieval thing that causes dissection to be frowned upon. It's thought to be bad. On the other hand, it's a Roman that comes up with the first diagnosis of inflammation that is still taught in medical school. So his name is Aulus Cornelius Celsus, and he was from around 50 CE.
Ah.
What were we going to say, Christina?
Oh, nope. I know him well because he was a pagan and he really wrote some very interesting challenges to what Christianity was doing relative to being the government religion.
Sorry, it's a different Celsus.
Oh, is it? Oh,
it is.
Well, never mind. I'm sure there were tons.
The Romans did have sort of like 12 names. But there's these 4 symptoms of inflammation: calor, dolor, tumor, rubor: heat, pain, swelling, and redness. And so we still use those. So I think that's pretty fascinating. And I'm wondering though, like, where your guys, your like medieval scholars that were doing magic, where they got their knowledge. Like I've described mine from the actual books that they took from the ancient and classical worlds. What about you?
So I think we have a big similarity, actually, because, and I think I saw a question in the chat about where did the sort of Celtic traditions fit? Cool. And so that's this is a perfect opportunity to answer that question.
Cool. Because some more questions after 8 o'clock, but we'll make sure that our questions at 8,
absolutely. It just kind of fits too well with what we're talking about. So indeed, these scholarly ceremonial magicians really knew that what they were practicing stretched back into antiquity, and they knew that they were practicing this ancient art. Now, I do have to say that it was very Mediterranean and actually more genuinely Egyptian in terms of, I love that one. I threw that in because it's just too perfect. This is exactly what we're talking about here. So they knew that it came from Egypt, from Mesopotamia, from Greece, from the Mediterranean world. Um, Ceremonial magic did not actually come from the German world, or more ancient German or Germanic traditions. It did not come from more ancient Celtic traditions. Indeed, those traditions are represented more in what I think Chrissy and I will be talking about in our next talk, which was the practical application. What did like the average person do to solve these same problems of health and good fortune that we've been talking about, right? So none of that was addressed by ceremonial magic. Now, interestingly enough, people have been looking for years for some remnants of belief in pagan traditions in witchcraft. And as far as the most recent scholarship is concerned, they don't exist, which can be disappointing to people.
Fascinating.
However, guess where they are? They are clearly, at least from a Mediterranean perspective, in the ceremonial magics of folks like this gentleman here.
Mhm.
So there is a pagan holdout in terms of culture that survived into the Middle Ages. It's just not where we were looking for it with witches. It's with these guys.
It's not folk, it's elite. And you would
Indeed.
have thought that with Christianity, maybe elite would have been the first to stop that pagan tradition down. That's fascinating. Fascinating.
Yeah. But I feel like because ceremonial magic was mostly practiced by guys, I don't get a lot to talk a lot about gender or women, but I know that there is certainly a place in both magic and medicine for issues of gender and how women were viewed. And so I don't know, Chrissy, can you tell us a little bit about that? Because
I would love to. I would. I,
awesome.
I just love weird stuff. That's why I do what I do. I'm so happy about it. Thought you'd never ask. So I want to talk about some of the things that the people really got wrong. So we've gone from like the very high, those celestial spheres. Now we're down into the body, and I want to talk about female bodies in particular. So I mentioned that dissection was frowned upon, and I'm going to see when you don't actually look at a human body, what do you come up with? And what you come up with can be some really interesting and very, very much part and parcel of a culture influenced ideas about the body. So, welcome here, friends, to the Kiveris vena, or the female vein. So, you can see the picture on the left describes it more clearly. And so here we have elite views on anatomy that are so wrong. So wrong. So see the blue arrow, and you can look at the blue arrow, and there's like this diagonal line. That is the female vein, the Kiveris vena. It was imaginary, but what it was is, okay, just try to hold your whatever stomach together. So there was a kind of query about where breast milk came from, because why do the breasts contain milk, and where does it come from? And so they're like, well, it's fluid, and so women make fluid when they have periods. So maybe when women menstruate, then that blood somehow goes up to this vein and gets somehow turned into milk, and that's what the babies are fed with. And it's like searching for El Dorado. They obviously didn't find it, but this is actually on the right is Leonardo da Vinci, and he has this Kiveris vena. You can barely see it. It's like if you look, you can find. I don't know if you can see my arrow, but it's like here. But yeah, so that was totally wrong. By the way, it also sometimes was thought that somehow semen and could be transformed blood. There's a lot of ideas about transformations of bodily effluences. And can I go on another one, because this is so great?
Oh yeah.
So this is like the most famous one. We've all heard the word hysterical, and I don't know if any of us know what that means, but it comes from the Greek word womb. And hysteria was a disease that basically meant a whole bunch of stuff was wrong with women. So it's only for women, and it could be anything. It was like when they didn't diagnose something like she's crazy, hysteria, headaches, hysteria, fainting, hysteria. And a Greek idea. So here you have a doctor, and he's examining a female body. Um, so there was an idea that it's actually a physician from the 2nd century called Oretius, who said that the womb of a woman is not attached to her body but floats around, and when it floats up a lot and bumps onto her head, she's hysterical. So ta-da. I love this because he also came up where I don't know, but anyway, here's a natural like explanation for what goes on with the uterus. The idea is that the uterus is altogether erratic. It delights in fragrant smells and advances towards them, and it has an aversion to fetid smells and flees from them. So you have a wandering uterus that like runs away from bad smelling things. And that would cause a lot of problems, wouldn't it there, Christina?
Indeed.
It's so great when people without uteruses like decide what's in a woman's body. And I want to show you this last. This is a schema of, it's a pretty rare image of a uterus in a body. And I just think it's pretty interesting to just see what, elite people, how they would have portrayed it. If you are able to see words up at the top, you could make out the words for embryo, conceptus, and fetus. Those are cognates for what they are now. And then this, like, where is it? But I think it's, here it is. Okay, you can see down at the bottom and going up this vertical thing, it says Hec eat via veretri. This is the path for the male genitalia. Fascinating. And I just think it's really kind of interesting to note that the medieval perception of the body was definitely influenced by Christianity. And there was this idea that the body of a fetus was formed before a soul was in it. So in fact, if a woman, terminated her pregnancy with an abortion, although it was considered a crime, it was considered the same sort of crime as if she used birth control or actually engaged in any sexual activity without the intent of becoming pregnant. So the term sodomy in medieval Europe really only meant sex that wasn't vaginal intercourse with the penis. Really, really specific. And I just think that that's pretty interesting. And this idea, changed throughout the Middle Ages, but it's interesting that you have an idea that's very, very Christian, and because it talks about the soul, and yet has a pretty different conclusion than what a lot of what we think of as traditional Christian churches conclude about abortion today. So I just think that's super fascinating. And I was wondering though, we are at 8. Okay, so we're at 8. What I want to do is ask, first of all, Christina, I feel like I went a little longer than I wanted to. First of all, is there any takeaway that you want to say? And then secondly, I'm wondering if people would throw questions in the chat. And nobody's a prisoner here, but you can ask any kinds of questions that you like. We could really talk about this for a long time. So Christina, first, as people are thinking of chatting questions, and I'll stop the share. Or no, maybe, do you want me to go to any slides too?
Nope, but I'm happy to summarize. I think what the theme in terms of magic anyway is that there are two major kinds. There's sort of common practical magic, stay tuned, and ceremonial, scholarly, intellectual magic. The ceremonial, scholarly, intellectual magic was the purview of an elite, but it was absolutely descended from a Mesopotamian and Mediterranean and also very specifically Egyptian culture and an Egyptian worldview. And it was proudly both religious in its way, although it was never truly accepted by the church, but tolerated. But it was also a very proud counterculture of people saying, yeah, we're just going to do this because we want to learn about the world and we want to acquire as much knowledge as possible so that we can bring good health and bring good fortune. But to me, that is where they also started to slide over into science and slide over into medicine and what we would call science and medicine. And interestingly enough, just very, very quickly, in the spells where people are summoning angels rather than demons, the steps that you would take in order to get your angel to appear are actually called experiments. And it's one of
Wow.
the earliest sort of colloquial uses of the term. And I just thought that that was a really interesting tie-in to science and medicine. So that's it.
That's super
How
cool.
about you, Chrissy? Do you have a little summary?
Um, I feel like one of the things that is really artificially separated when I'm talking about medicine is theory and practice. Because, for example, with dissection, and do you mind if I go back to the slides just to show? Because I think there's a really cool one that I forgot. But so I'm saying, over and over, okay, the magic or sorry, medicine is really, there's these higher ups that just write about it, and then the lower downs that are doing it, but it's not quite that distinct. And dissection is one of those places. So again, hold on to your whatever. But so obviously we even have Galen going back. And here, this is just a fact. So this is the guy that's like in the red robes. That's Nero, and he's being a jerk because what he's doing is he's watching his mother get dissected. He was really a super jerk. So there's that. Now Nero's obviously a bad guy, and that's an example of that. But there were people in Italy in 1300 um, that allowed dissection to take place in the medical schools. And it's one of the reasons that the medical tradition in medieval Italy was more advanced than other places in the world. Because, if you know what's in a person's body, what do you know? That actually is pretty helpful. So I think that's super interesting. Yeah, his name was Frederick II, dies in 1250. So there we are. And the first person to perform a human dissection was a physician in 1315. What are you
So
going to say? I want to hear it.
Michael Scott, the middle of the three bros,
Oh,
Michael Scott was the court magician of Frederick II.
oh, yeah. Frederick II is a really fascinating
Yeah,
guy.
he's a really fascinating guy. So
Yes,
yep,
yes. Yep.
that dude right there in the middle, that's Michael Scott. He was a scholar, a public intellectual, perhaps the greatest mind of his age, and he was a scientist, an astrologer, and a court magician. But yeah, he worked for Frederick II. So
So interesting. And I think another thing that's a little artificial that I tend to do, I tend to be like the scientific era and the non-scientific era, but that is really overstating the case. Like Isaac Newton had many more works of occult trying to in alchemy than he did on physics.
yeah,
And we
people call him the last great sort of court magician, actually.
Exactly. And so, like, for example, this is early modern, this is from 1751, and it's a dissection occurring. And I just think that it's important to realize like ideas about dissection somehow being associated with bad continue. And here it's to highlight the way that in Britain, if you were to be executed, one of the ways to make your execution even worse was to promote the fact that you would be then dissected at a medical school. So you can see all these like people kind of being ghoulishly laughing over this guy, and you can see his entrails coming out and the skeletons on either side. And I just think it's interesting to notice that ideas about pollution and death and dissection continue very
No,
much.
and I see a whole nother talk on the use of human body parts, not only in magic, but also in medicine, because, oh my goodness, folks, that was a huge trade from antiquity through, well, probably the 1600s till, and perhaps even farther into history, depending on which accounts you believe. So,
So interesting. Yeah. I'm going to look and see what questions we have so far. Let's see, where's my chat? But keep on, because I also have something else that I wanted to say. Why isn't my chat showing? Christina, is it showing for you?
oh,
Oh, I know.
um,
Share. Let's see. Let's do
let
that.
me see if I can
I
get
got
my
it. I
mouse.
got it. Oh, is it
Okay.
dissection or vivisection? The woman being dissected in the Nero slide, she was dead, but her eyes are open. I know that's really gross. And she is tied up. And that probably is because, if they didn't tie her arms underneath her, her body would have like fallen off the table or something. But it's also to show what a jerk Nero was. Like even in death, he's doing this mean thing to his mommy because he's a jerk. Yeah. He tries to kill her in a bunch of different ways.
This is true. Oh, and Deborah, in answer to your question, although I think I coincidentally did when I got all excited about the mention of Frederick II, that center figure was Michael Scott, who again was that great intellectual proto-scientist and also ceremonial magician.
Very, very cool. I wanted to, there was a body part that I wanted to show that I didn't show. Do you care if I do that? Because it's so
Oh, please, that's
well,
awesome.
it's so weird. So this is about ideas, and it's kind of again to show the bleeding between. No, I'm using like bleeding, and we're talking about blood stuff. Of the medieval to early modern period. So this is about this is about ideas of how babies are formed. So there's not an no microscopes, and in the Greek period there came about an idea that you the whole like content of a human is located in the sperm, and then the sperm would go into the uterus, and the woman would kind of be like a little tent, or the body of the woman would be a little tent that just kind of cooked the fetus until it was ready to come out. So these are pre-formationists, and you can see here, this is on the right, the sperm with the little like baby in it. So that's, or the fetus, and that's 1695, that late. But I think it's kind of fun to know that the opposite view did emerge. So there was an idea called by this guy called Lazzari Spallanzani, and he thought women's ova were the things that contained the whole of the human, and that there was kind of just this necessary chemical catalyst needed from the sperm to start things going. And he actually thought that the this is kind of funny, he thought that sperm were wormy parasite things, because back in the day, so this is fascinating, there's a lot of worm stuff in, or literature before the microscope, because there's not an idea of bacteria. They don't know what that is. So if it looks at all like a worm, it was interpreted to be kind of like a worm. And there's an idea that what he wanted to test his idea, so he actually dressed frogs, male frogs, in little taffeta pants and had them go to town with female frogs to see the effect of sperm. Isn't that amazing? That's a scientific method, though. So then we're getting really out of your And so I see another question. Okay. Oh, good. Okay, so I think this first one is for you, Christina, from Hannah.
Oh, nice. For some reason, I haven't seen
It
it.
just came. Do you want me to read it to you?
Oh, could you? Yes, because I'm not
All right.
getting those.
Awesome. So she asks if you could explain a bit more about the witchcraft trials done by the Greeks and Romans, because she's a sixth and seventh grade curriculum teacher, and if it can be made into PG language, that'd be really cool.
Oh, awesome. Absolutely. So I am also in my spare time a middle school teacher. So I teach seventh and eighth grade. And so let me see, if I was going to talk to my seventh and eighth graders about this, what would I say? um, yeah, actually, there isn't anything terrible about the Roman witch trials other than the scope and the fact that so many people died. So, unlike perhaps in more early modern times, the Romans didn't tend to subject anyone to torture, to try to get them to confess anyone. It was more of a response that occurred. Because there were plagues. So there were several plagues in the early hundreds BCE, for example. The response to which the Roman government said, all right, clearly we're going to put people to death for this because this can't keep happening. And because there was no understanding of germ theory or anything even remotely like it, obviously they looked for bad actors. And because Rome, unlike Egypt, had a well-developed understanding of witchcraft or belief in witchcraft, that was particularly linked to women. Unfortunately, those that died, and there were like 1,300. It was probably one of Europe's largest single moment witch trials. So 1,300 women were put to death, and they were universally women because in Rome, women were found to be mostly guilty of malevolent magic. So,
Although it like and wasn't it around was that around the time of Sidonius Apollinaris and the Golden Ass?
yes, it was
Yeah, and he was a
indeed.
guy, and wasn't he put on trial?
He was, but I don't believe he was executed.
No, no, no.
No,
He was able
he
to.
talked himself out of it, actually. And indeed,
Oh,
um,
what new?
we, we do tend to see that happening a lot, especially in Rome, unless the accusations of witchcraft were tied to something like treason, which we actually see them throughout the Middle Ages. Generally speaking, there weren't in the early Middle Ages that many witch trials at all. If any, it was quite infrequent, unless there was an accusation of using your magical skills, which could be astrology, could be divination, right? If you were um, you know, casting an astrology reading to determine perhaps what the best day would be to kill whichever king you were interested in killing, that's treason, right? So then you would be killed, but not usually otherwise, at least in the early Middle Ages.
So interesting. Hannah asked another question, and her question was, um, did medieval people believe sex for any purpose other than procreation was a sin? Does that refer to anything other than male with female sex, or were they against sex for pleasure? They were against sex for pleasure. They were. So, like the only reason that you'd have sex was to conceive. And but there's an idea that because we're sinful, we're going to have sex anyway, unless we're a monk, and then we're awesome. And so we get married for that. And so then it's like it's not the greatest, but you're not in mortal sin if you are married and having sex. Now, there's a really big lacuna between theory and practice in this. I mean, because the people that were writing on this were monks, you know, a lot of them, and clergy. So, but it really does shape ideas about European sexuality that we inherit today, definitely. And a great resource for this that's super funny and entertaining is Eleanor Jenga. She's awesome, and she has a blog called Going Medieval. And if you want to, if her article on sodomy is so funny, it's
It's
really,
the
really,
best.
it's
Oh my
really
gosh, I
funny.
can't recommend it enough. Also, she has really cool things about current politics and how they relate to the Middle Ages.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. She is
But
like,
also the sex stuff is amazing.
his name is her name Janelle
uh,
Monet.
oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah, she has a
Janelle
post
Monáe.
connecting Janelle Monet to Hildegard. That's really funny. But I see that there's another one for you, Christina, and it says during Roman occupation in Egypt, did magic and religion clash among all those faiths and ethnic groups, especially in urban areas like Alexandria?
Indeed, they did. Absolutely. And it was that clash that brought about when I mentioned the death of the Egyptian temple system. It was absolutely that clash because what we have is a culture that's really hostile to magic coming into a culture that was completely mostly I don't like generalities too much, but mostly completely accepting of it, and the result was an incredible clash and the destruction of the entire temple system. But then ultimately for our understanding of the medieval period, the result then is the creation of all of these texts that document the practices that we can then trace back to antiquity. So there's also a preservation of culture that might not have otherwise happened, and then an incredible cosmopolitan mixing that I also like. That's what I love about the ceremonial magic. It just takes a little bit of this and a little bit of that and stirs it all together to um, create a very interesting proto science that is also ultimately grounded in very deep, obvious superstition. So,
Yeah, Ethan posted the sodomy article, and yeah, it is really funny. And I got a question also from Rachel Schaefer, and she talks about how we define science and evidence-based medicine by the idea that a testable question exists. So there's a lot of gray area between medicine and magic, and she asks if there's any criteria that defined what was considered correct or believable in medieval medicine. And Rachel, you're right on the money when you talk about how we define, a kind of scientific question. Can it be tested? Is one of the prerequisites, and that's not at all the way. I mean, that's an early modern thing that really is a caesura that makes the Western scientific tradition special. So you would have definitely been in trouble if you practiced bad medicine. Like there's all kinds of concern that because if you let a person give you stuff, that person could kill you. So on a ground level, there was correct and incorrect medicine. There's also and I didn't really have time to talk about it, but so the Pope did issue an injunction against dissection. So that would have been considered obviously bad medicine during the Crusades. And recent scholarship suggests that it wasn't so much an anathema against dissection on a blanket level, but rather that the papacy was concerned because people were dying in the Eastern Mediterranean and then sending body parts back. And so it was to legislate against that. But I think that there's still an overall idea that dissection's not okay. There's something about, I'm sure we've heard of the idea that, there's in anthropology concepts of pollution that don't correlate to our ideas about germs, because there's no idea about germ theory. But all ancient religions and traditions have idea about what's unclean, and those bleed over into medicine. And I'm sure they do, Christina, in magic as well, right?
Oh, big time. We didn't get into it at all because, frankly, there isn't enough time.
Right.
But to be an appropriately practicing ceremonial magician, the amount of focus or time that you need to take to make sure that you are ritually cleansed in order to do whatever magic you're going to do, it was huge. In fact, there are pages, if you look at the Picatrix, like there are pages and pages of making sure that you abstained from sex, obviously, but also from touching a dead body because they were ritually unclean, from eating certain kinds of foods, and then if you throw in, well, the moon has to be in the right mansion and the sun has to be in the right zodiac sign, and my goodness, but it all boils down to that ritualistic idea of pollution and cleanliness.
And one of the things that your point like makes me really think, Christina, is how in the era before the scientific revolution, an idea would be like, oh, look, we know this is true because we see this, this, and this. So we go like, oh, pattern recognition. Look it, I got the results I wanted, and I also dressed right. The moon was the right phase, blah, blah, blah. Same with the medicine. Hey, look, we've done all these specific things correctly, so it must be, what we're doing obviously works. And that we all know that that's confirmation bias. And that's exactly what you don't want in the scientific method, where you go around and what you try to do is show that the ideas that you're thinking about are wrong. And if ever you can show that, like, okay, whatever, hydrogen isn't made up, or water isn't made up of H2O. If you can prove that to be the case, then your idea is out the window.
Right.
Yeah, that's very cool. Yeah. So I don't see more questions, and I hate to keep everybody. Christina and I are planning on doing another talk. We want to do magic and medicine, but practical magic and medicine. Oh, I see one new message here. So just in case, it's excellent. You are so welcome, everybody. And I hope that you have a wonderful weekend, and that, all the signs are well for you.
Have a great weekend. Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody. I'm going to stop the recording before I forget, Christina.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Let's do this. Stop recording.